This is the last Polycon UK webinar of the year before we take a break. We'll be back after the job market, I think. Today, we're very happy to have Okuyama. There you go. I was thinking about Uppsala, now I get. Okuyama, who's going to talk about electoral institutions, women representation, policy outcomes. Oko is from Uppsala, and this is a joint paper by Ayumi Sudo. Before I pass the floor to Yoko, can I just remind everybody this is 45 minutes with a 15 minutes Q&A. We don't have a caller with us today, so if you want to ask questions, just unmute yourselves and ask the question directly. I don't think your chat is going to be very practical today. Okay, well, without further ado, Yoko, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to present this work, which is a joint work with Ayumi. She's actually an undergraduate student at Yale and has been a fantastic co-author of mine. So the idea behind this paper is really to better understand the effect of women's greater representation on policy makings. Let me start with the fact that the share of women in the national parliament in many countries has grown over time. And here I'm showing the trend of women's share in the national parliament in each OECD country are since 1945, with the solid line indicating the world average. And as the share of women has grown, there is an increasing attention on what is the policy consequences of our greater women's representation. And so just to illustrate, let me picture one figure where I have percentage change in the share of female lawmakers in the last 5 decades on the x-axis. And I'm going to plot the improvement of equality between men and women before law, which is captured by the Women, Business and Law Index by World Bank. This is just one example of the policy consequences that represent more women's interest. And as we see that there is a positive association between our two, indicating that greater women's representation seem to get translated into greater policy consequences. Of course, that wasn't cross-country association, but as we know that there is a growing body of causal evidence on the effect of greater women's representation on public policy makings. For example, there is a paper showing that having more women increases governmental spendings on the issues that women are interested in, or the bill proposal that are related to women's interests or gender issues. And this line of literature is consistent with the citizen candidate paradigm, where who represents matters. Interestingly, however, there are other papers did not find significant effects of greater women's representation on policy makings. This line of literature or these papers are perhaps more consistent with the median voter paradigm, where politicians' identities do not matter so much, but regardless of the gender, politicians will not appeal to the median voter. So this mixed evidence is really interesting and raises a question of under what condition does the greater women's representation result in the policy consequences? And this is the broader question that we are after in this project. But in particular, we focus our attention on the role of electoral system. And we get this inspiration from the old discussion in the political science and as well as the econ literature on the role of institutions. And to illustrate our idea, let me go back to this cross-country figure, where we're gonna plot countries by groups based on the electoral systems. First, we plot the countries with proportional representation systems. And again, we see a positive association between the increase in women's representation and the public policy outcomes. Now, for countries with plurality majority systems, we no longer see the positive association. And the countries with mixed system are lying in the middle. And by the way, this picture holds even I exclude all the countries with our electoral reforms in before, or our countries with gender quotas. And so this is a cross-country association, but again, this really makes us think that the electoral system might play a role. So the question is it causal? Do electoral institutions causally affect the policy consequences of greater women's representation? And this is the question that we are trying to answer empirically. Answering this question is not a trivial undertaking, because cross-country variation in institutions is prone to indigeneity, namely endogenous choice of institutions. So therefore, in this study, we exploit the within-country variation in electoral tiers, in particular in the context of the Japanese lower house elections in the last decade, which combines single-member district tier and the proportional representation tier. And I'm gonna call SMD and PL in the remaining of the talk. And so because of the unique feature of the Japan's mixed system, SMD seats and PL seats are quasi-randomly allocated for the marginal candidates. And so basically this quasi-random allocation of the seats allows us to identify the effect of electoral tier on the legislative activities. And we apply the simulation-based regression discontinuity to this context, and I'll be more specific in a moment. And then we estimate the effect of the electoral tiers, SMD versus PL, on men's and women's legislative activities, and whether or not they are addressing women's interests in their legislative activities. We measure legislative activities by 3 components. One is the petitions that they endorse. The second, written questions that they submitted. And third, legislative committees that they attended. At this moment, I want to caveat that perhaps petitions are the best measurement of the legislators' preferences, because they have greater autonomy over which petition they endorse. Whereas the committee assignments might be also influenced by the party discipline. But I'd be happy to discuss more in the discussion phase. And at this moment, you may wonder, what are the women's interests in this context? So we classify energy, nuclear power, education, and childcare policies are women's group interests in the Japanese context. And we do so based on the pre-election surveys on voters and candidates' policy preferences. And basically, based on that, we make a list of keywords that are associated with these policy areas. And then find the petitions and questions that include the keywords and label them as women's interests. And so in other words, we employ the dictionary-based approach to classify legislative activities into either women's interests or not.
Yoko, can I ask a question about this last point?
Yes.
This is an interesting group of policy areas, because I would have thought that maybe there were more direct policy areas that you could have looked at, like, for example, women, being able to take time off of work for maternity leave. It could be, on reducing the salary gap between men and women. I mean, things that are more directly. Is it because there's not enough of these that you've chosen these other? Because I mean, energy, nuclear power, I can see that maybe women are more environmentally as a group. The median woman is probably more environmentally friendly than the median man, but they don't strike me as particularly women related, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And let me come back to your question later, but my short answer is yes, actually, something related to gender gap or gender wage gap or discrimination against women, they should be also classified into the women's group interests. And in the when we list the keywords, actually we include them as well, just because in the pre-election surveys, there is no such a category as gender issues. And this is by the construction of the survey. And this was a little bit unfortunate. So that's why in the classification of petitions and written questions, we actually also include keywords directly related to our gender. But I'll show you in a moment, and hopefully it's gonna be more clear. But thank you for that question. Are there any other questions?
I have just one short question about the first bullet point. This is something that, will you explain more on these differences in electoral, on this?
Yes.
Thank you.
So perhaps when I get to the electoral system, it's gonna be clear. So
thanks.
Let me move on. Thanks. And so before that, let me quickly preview the findings, and then I'm gonna jump into the content. So to preview the findings, overall, I find that female legislators address women's interests more than men, and which is consistent with a lot of existing papers, but less so when they represent districts vis-a-vis proportional representation blocks. In other words, our SMD representatives behave a bit similarly, regardless of their gender. In particular, for petitions among PR representatives, so they happen to get PL seats, the gender gap in the number of petition endorsements is around 0.1 standard deviation unit. But the gender gap among SMD representatives goes down about a half. We see the similar pattern for question memoranda, albeit the estimate being noisy. For committee assignments among PR representatives, the gender gap in the probability of serving women-related committees is as large as 27 percentage points. But again, this gender gap shrinks among the district representatives. And so overall, we see that electoral tier matters for whether or not women act on behalf of women's interests. And later we discuss why it is the case. And our interpretation is that our legislators are both citizen candidates and career-oriented, but perhaps the district representative has a greater incentives to cater to the median voter, but which may not be compatible with addressing women's group interests. And overall, the broader takeaway of this empirical study is that in order to make use of diverse voices, having more representation of traditionally underrepresented group is one thing, but also institutional designs matter. Because if people are not incentivized to voice their group interests, they wouldn't do so.
Can I ask you a question, Yoko?
Yes.
Yeah, so with regards to this, so I suppose you're going to explain it a little bit more, but so when we think about women's group interest, to what extent in Japan is there such thing as an acknowledged group interest of women? So is there a large feminist movement that's very political? So you may say that on average, women care a little bit more about energy issues and perhaps a little bit more about childcare provision, but there's no agreement that that is all women's interests. And so if a politician starts to align a little bit more in certain lines, there's no agreement that that politician is particularly pro-women if there's no like agreement that that's what women want, right? So to what extent is there an organized demand for women's vote? For women's issues? And second question is there a lot of, how does turnout measure by gender in Japan? So is there low turnout of women, high turnout of women? And yeah. So, yeah. So, and I suppose that all relates to some of the results you're finding.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the second question is easier to answer. So there is no gender gap in electoral turnout. And if anything, women's turnout is higher than men's. Although I have to admit that the electoral turnout in Japan is overall lower than other countries. And for the first question, do you have any particular measurement that you're interested in?
I think somehow I'm worried about the coordination problem. It's like, are all women going to agree that this is a good candidate that you want to get elected if that candidates particularly advocate on certain women's issues that we all agree that they are? So for instance, if we compare with the US, although I'm not an expert on the US, we could all agree that during the Hillary Clinton election, who was the pro-women candidate was very clear. In an electoral, in a legislative election, if there's no particular questioning of feminism, women's issues, do people particularly agree with who is the best candidate to vote for?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and that might be related to the mechanism and something that I'd love to think more about it, but maybe there are some disagreements on like who is the best women candidate even among women, are depending on which of the political spectrum women are in. So, but maybe let me discuss more.
My question isn't particularly clear either, so
no, but that's a very interesting question, and yeah, I'd love to discuss more later. Thank you. Great. Okay, so quickly, the contribution of this paper is, first of all, this paper builds on the literature on the on the causal effect of women's representation on public policy consequences, and I want to kind of reconcile the mixed evidence and provide a explanation for that. And also our study falls into a broader research agenda on the interplay between political institutions and policy choices. And lastly, we kind of owes the idea from the older discussion in the political science on women's representation in electoral system. And we are hoping to present the causal evidence of the institutional effect. So let me jump into the electoral system in Japan. And so we are focusing on the House of Representatives or lower house elections in the last decade, which are studied to employ the mixed electoral system in 1996, where as of 2017, 289 seats are allocated to district election, and you see in the map, each segment is a district. And also the remaining 176 seats are allocated to the regional proportional representation, where our multi-parties use the party lists. And so candidates can run for both districts and proportional representation block. Unlike German system, there is no proportionality, meaning that the number of seats allocated to districts versus PL blocks are fixed. No residency requirements for filing candidacy, and compared to candidacy. Okay. Importantly, and what we find in the data is that even though people are double nominated, once they win their single member district, they are more likely to rerun and run in the same district in the next election. The meaning that winning the SMD seat implies that they're gonna be the future or district candidate in the same district. And lastly, Japan does not have gender quota yet. And so this is the situation where we can turn off the effect of gender quota. And just a few words on the Japanese politics. This is way simplified, but we have a multi-party system. During the period of time of our study, the Liberal Democratic Party has been in power all the time, except for 2009 and 2012. Women's share has grown from around 3 to 4% to 10% in the last decade. In other words, gender issue or women's representation is a pressing issue in Japan as well. So before going into the further detail, let me quickly talk about data. We have 3 segments of data sets. One is, of course, the data on the electoral outcomes that later we're going to use it for regression discontinuity. And we have 3 measurements of legislative activities that are petition endorsement. So in the Japanese system, of course, citizens have the right to submit petitions to the parliament, but when they do so, they need to get legislators' signature. And so by looking at which legislator signed which petition, we can tell which policy areas they're interested in. And there is no party discipline over which petition or which legislator signed. And the next measurement is written questions that our legislators submit. And for example, when they want to ask questions to the cabinet members about the recent government's policy and et cetera. And also, this is also can be done so by a single legislator without having any other member support. And also we have the data on the standing committee membership. And the last segment of data is the candidate and voter survey from the last 4 elections, where we can elicit policy priorities of voters and candidates. And so just to show you what kind of policy areas that Japanese women prioritize vis-a-vis men prioritize, here is our descriptive statistics. So the survey asks both voters and candidates to pick one of 16 policy areas as the first priority. And as you can see, there is no gender as a policy area, which is a little bit unfortunate for the purpose of my study. But I calculate the share of women who pick each policy area as a first priority. I do so for men as well and take the gender gap. I plot the gender gap for voters on the x-axis and candidates on the y-axis. So at the top left, top right corner, we have policy areas that are prioritized by women more than men, and that are energy and nuclear power plant policy and education and childcare. You may wonder why we have a nuclear power plant. But perhaps this is largely because of our Fukushima nuclear power accident. And after that, there is an enormous concern regarding health issues, and that really attracts women's attention. On the left bottom corner, we have policy areas that are rather preferred by men more than women.
Yoko, can I ask 2 questions very quickly?
Yes.
The first question is, I have some experience, being Italian with these mixed electoral systems. And so, for example, in Italy, often the proportional list is sort of an insurance policy for top party candidates who don't make it into the single district, right? So even if they lose that, they still get elected. So they're put at the top of a. So do you have evidence that the percentage of men and women who get elected and listed in these 2 sort of things is more or less homogeneous, so that there isn't a selection effect there? And the second question has to do with this last thing that you've just shown us. I mean, I would have thought that this nuclear power plant issue is perhaps more pressing for those people who live close to a nuclear power plant, and that is related to the single districts, right? So in other words, if I represent a district that has a power plant not too far away, that's whether I'm a man or a woman, that's gonna influence my. Now, I'm not sure how this, haven't been able to think about how this affects the analysis that you're doing, but is this something that you're aware of, have been thinking about?
Yeah. So thank you so much for the first question. We do not. So I think for the mixed system question, we do not see any gender gap in winning through the party list after losing the district. But let me come back to that, because I use that particular property in order to elicit the randomness of allocation of district and proportional representation seats. So that's very interesting. And we'll see how Italian system and Japanese system differ or the same. For the next question, so I think what this picture implies about nuclear power plant and energy is that perhaps for the local people around the nuclear power plants, both men and women prioritize this issue because this is their own issue. But also more broadly, even outside of the area, there are people who are really care about energy and nuclear power plant issue, particularly because Fukushima is the place for agriculture products. And so we hear or we see that, at least anecdotally, mothers really care about where the food are coming from. So perhaps that raises more women's awareness about this issue compared to men outside of the district that are directly affected by the accident. So that is one probable reason why we see a gender gap are in the policy priority for this particular issue. That's my interpretation. Great. So so let me move on to how we categorize petitions and questions utilizing these information. So what we try to do is to list up keywords. So we looked at all the corpus are related to the petitions and questions, and list up keywords that are related to the earlier policy areas that are, again, childcare, education, energy, and nuclear power plants. Now, we faced one problem, which is that the list of policy areas earlier didn't include gender issues directly. So the way we do is that first in the list one, we listed the words that are directly talking about gender, like men and women, girls, sexual harassment, domestic violence against women. And then after that, in list two, we added more keywords that are related to education or energy and nuclear power plant, etc. And we use both narrower definition of women's interests and broader definition of broader women's interests. And then categorize questions and petitions into women related or not. And then we see the robustness of the result. So, and then here are the summary statistics. Or maybe we can skip them for now and jump into the electoral system so that I can talk more about the identification. Here I just showing you kind of the summary statistics of, for example, the number of petitions related to women's interest by legislators, gender, and electoral tiers. And overall, we see our consistent pattern with our cross-country evidence. But let me jump for now. And let me actually talk more about our electoral system and identification. So now moving on to how exactly our mixed electoral system works and how we exploit its feature. Again, so candidates can run both for PR and SMD, and actually the majority of the candidates do so. Before the election, parties present fixed ballot lists. So this is, in theory, a closed list PR, but interesting and importantly, parties are allowed to list multiple candidates or at an identical rank. And then voters vote for a candidate in a district and a party for the PR block. After polls close, PR seats are allocated across parties are based on the vote share that party gained. And within a district, a candidate who gained the largest vote share wins the seat. And then SMD winners who are double nominated opt out from the party list. And the remaining PL candidates are re-ranked in a lexicographical order. First they rank candidates based on the prefixed ranking, because this is technically a closed list. And then within the same rank, candidates are ordered according to their performance in their district, which is the loss win margin, or that is calculated by their own vote count in SMD race divided by the vote count of a SMD winner. And once we have the exposed PL list, then we can determine the PL winners. So best illustrate what I mean by that is an example. So here at the left top, I have one example from a district in 2017 election, where the top candidate A from LDP party, Liberal Democratic Party, and candidate B from CDP competed against each other at a very narrow margin. And there was another candidate. And so, but by a very tiny margin, candidate A won the seat. So what happened to candidate B? Let's look at CDP's party ballot here on the right. So interestingly, this party ranked everybody at the top. So the pre-election ranking was one for everybody. Exposed, 4 candidates won their district seat. So that's why SMD being one, and then they opted out from the list. And so the question is how to order the remaining candidates. And then we use this loss win margin, which is calculated by going back to the district race, or basically divide this candidate B's votes by candidate A's votes. And so as their races close, this loss win margin is getting closer to 1. And as the loss win margin is getting close to 1, the candidate B's likelihood to win the PL seat is almost surely 1. And so what this implies is that when you compete narrowly in the district race, getting either this district seat vis-a-vis getting a PL seat is as good as random, because if person B happened to gotten a tiny bit more votes in this district, B were able to secure the district seat, and then A might lost, but against A goes to his party list. He's gonna rank to the top in the party list, and then he's gonna secure the PL seat. So really these propensity to win of A and B are very close. But by accident, A secured the district seat and B secured the PL seat. And so basically, I'm gonna use this by accident difference in the propensity to win as the source of variation or quasi-random allocation of seats. And so that basically makes me use the simulated based regression discontinuity, which is proposed by Kotakopi et al. And originally used in the Finnish open list PR system, but it can be also applied to our complex mixed selection system. And the practical steps are as follows. So we have the data on the vote shares in the real elections. And based from these empirical distributions of the votes, we resample a fixed number of votes and recalculate the election result. Basically who won which seat. So this is one simulated election. And then repeat the simulation for many times. And after that, for each candidate I, we calculate the winning propensity, that is the share of winnings out of the total number of simulations. Winning propensity is 1 if a candidate I won by a big margin in the real election, because the tiny simulation error should not affect the election result. Whereas if the candidates were competing very narrowly, the winning propensity is not gonna be 1, because the tiny simulation error affects the election result. And so we use this measurement to capture the fact that our candidates are competing narrowly. And then using that, kind of going back to the original idea of RD, we compare the winning propensity of the top candidate and the runner-up in a district. Take the average of them as a cutoff, measure the distance between the cutoff and each candidate winning propensity, and use it as a running variable for the regression discontinuity.
Yoko, it's 3:44 now, so if approximately 10 minutes or less, if you can, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great. So yes, so the remainder are, now we have the running variable, so the remaining step of the regression discontinuity is just the same as the standard regression discontinuity. And the picture is not pretty yet, but on the left, we have the distribution of our running variable. We do not detect any manipulation around the cutoff. On the right, we have the relationship between the winning SMD seat against the running variable, and there is a jump at the cutoff. And then we perform the regression discontinuity just as usual using the optimal bandwidth. We run it by gender And what we are interested in is not only the SMD effect, but actually we are very interested in the gender gradient of the SMD impact. So, and in the regression, in the paper, we run regressions with and without or some control variables just to see a robustness, which include tenure and party dummies. And so we are ready to show the result quickly.
Jump in and ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a little bit confused if you can go back to the RD plots that you just shown. So the SMD, no, the next one actually. So can you just clarify for me what the treatment is here? So to the right of the cutoff, you win the SMD seat. To the left of the cutoff,
Winning a PL seat. So both are winners. Yeah.
But wouldn't it be some candidates that are very close to winning an SMD seat, but don't win a seat? And do you want to condition on that? Was my question.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and that's why we are using this simulated regression discontinuity, because if so what you said could happen, for example, if a candidate is listed at the lower rank or bottom in the pre-election ranking, and for that kind of candidate, this winning propensity is penalized in a sense that their propensity to win in this election is gonna lower than other candidates. And so in a sense, this winning propensity to win is a summary statistics of summarizing all the information, including pre-election ranking, competition within party, and also competition against other party in the district. And that cannot be captured if we apply the standard regression discontinuity to the district election only. I mean, we could have done so because we have SMD portion in our system. And then actually there are other papers using that in this mixed election system. But I would think that is a little bit misleading precisely because what you pointed out, that something else is going on at the other half.
Great, thank you.
So quickly show you the results and we can move on to the last discussion phase. So first of all, for visibility, I'm showing the coefficients in the graph, in the figure. So let me focus on the bottom panel. The black bar shows the gender gap in the number of petitions on women's interests among PL representatives. And the middle gray bar is the gender gap in petitions on women's interests among SMD representative. And the gap between this bar, which is delta 2 in the earlier equation, is the causal effect of the electoral tier. Well, we see that among PL representative, women are more likely to endorse petitions on women's interests by almost 1 standard deviation, but the gap shrinks among SMD representatives. And the pattern is the same, regardless of the definition of the women's interests. We repeat the same exercise for the probability of submitting questions on women's topic. Here, the point estimate shows the similar pattern as the petitions, but actually the gap between PL and SMD is not statistically significant. Lastly, we are looking at the probability of attending committee on women's interests, where for now we define committees on women's interests as education, environment, labor, and welfare committees. At the top panel, again, the black bar shows the gender gap in probability of attending committee on women's interests. And the middle gray bar shows the gender gap in probability of attending committee on women's interests among SMD representatives. And the gap between two bars shows the electoral tier effect. And then this is again a statistically significant difference. And we see that the gender gap shrinks under our SMD tier. We also looked at whether the symmetric effect happens for committees on men's interests, like industrial policies. And we do see the symmetric pattern, meaning that again, among PL representatives, men are more likely to attend these kind of committees. So overall, I would say that among PL representatives, there is larger gender gap and women act more on behalf of women's interests, whereas the SMD representatives behave a bit more similarly regardless of their gender. And so our interpretation of this result is legislators are perhaps both citizen candidates and career-oriented, but the career concern may differ depending on their institutional factor. And perhaps district representatives are trying to appeal the medium border, which may not be compatible with addressing women's group interests. Now, one discussion point is that you may ask, are there any party influence on their behavior? And in particular, some people, especially from political science perspective, one may ask, are PL women marginalized and kind of made to act on behalf of women? I cannot exclude that possibility, but the fact that we see this effect even for the petition endorsement, for which parties do not have discipline over, which means that there is an element of a citizen candidate in the sense that our female legislators are purely interested in these topics. And so with that, I want to conclude my talk for now. And this paper tries to causally examine the effect of electoral institution on the policy consequences of women's representation. And the broader takeaway of this empirical study is that in order to make use of diverse voices, our institutional designs matter. So with that, thank you so much. And I'd be happy to answer questions.
Okay, Yoko, thank you very much. It's time for questions now. I have a question if nobody does, but I'm happy to defer to anybody who wants to ask. So just please unmute yourselves.
Hi, I have a quick question if that's okay. I was wondering, so sometimes we think of the effect of PR versus single member district as like high influences how these politicians are going to campaign. But here the treatment is sort of ex post after the election, right? Whether I get allocated to one or the other. So do you think that the effect is like in terms of what they anticipate for the next election, or how do you think it's actually working through in terms of like the mechanism?
Yeah. Thank you for the excellent question. So this relates to our earlier discussion that I briefly talked about here, in the bullet point 4. So basically, if you win the district election, then the party would nominate you in that same district or in the next election as well. So perhaps that gives the greater incentive that this is your district during your term, and that makes you to focus on catering toward the voters in the district. And we actually did all the analysis on the degree to which they're gonna run in the same district, and we have that winning SMD makes you more likely to run in the same district. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Yes, I also would have a question. Hi, this is Anya. So I would be curious as to why you are pre-selecting the topics that women are interested in instead of doing a, I don't know, text-based analysis and trying to understand whether you get differences in the types of words that that women seem to be interested in, who win through proportional or SMD and relative to men.
That's an excellent question. So the short answer is that we are also trying to do text-based actually. But do you have any particular suggestion for how to do that, or?
No, I don't have a particular suggestion, but it would seem more, I don't know, it seems choosing the word is in some sense is a selection, and so I feel like they were selected by a machine algorithm. It would potentially be more neutral, but it also, you know, I'm not familiar with the Japanese setting, but it's not the case that women are purely interested in gender issues. Women also tend to have other interests, and that might be also culturally shaped. And so you might pick up on some things that tend to be more women's issues, although we might not have them on the radar.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. So yes, so one idea that we had and that we couldn't implement yet because of the data issue is that, for example, not here. If we had, so for example, for petition endorsement, if we had data on which citizens submitted this petition and related to the gender composition of the citizens that they signed as a voter, then we can have a better picture of which issue are more preferred by men and women voters. And then we can apply text classification to classify topics relate to the voter composition and do a data-driven way of classifying topics for gender. And that was the best case. For now, unfortunately, we don't have any information on the voters who are submitted petitions. But I mean, ideally, I'd love to. I see your point, and I'd love to do that if the data permits.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Arnaud Ellis has a question as well. Arnaud, you want to unmute yourself, please?
He's left.
He's left. Okay. So I think we can stop the recording here.